Hello, this is Liberty, and I'm here with my colleague Arthur, and today we're going to discuss a paper by Dick Allwright, 2005, From Teaching Points to Learning Opportunities and Beyond. But I think we'll both just start by saying briefly who we are. So I am an EFL teacher and have been teaching for the past 7 or 8 years, and I'm now a director of studies here in Bangkok. In 2019, I did a master's in English language teaching and applied linguistics. It's quite a mouthful, that degree name, ELT and applied linguistics at King's. And this paper that we're talking about was the first paper that I read for the course. So it has a special place in my heart, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
As am I. So my name's Arthur Lane, and I work with Liberty here in Bangkok, but I work in the teacher training department. I've been teaching since 2003, but in 2013 I became a CELTA tutor. I also worked as an ICELT tutor, which is an in-service teacher training qualification that Cambridge used to run, and most of that work was in mainstream schools in China. And fairly recently I've also become a Delta tutor, which is important for this discussion because becoming a Delta tutor does re-engage you with background reading. So it's been really good to read this article, and I'm seeing it as a springboard for other articles I might read in the coming weeks.
Okay,
Yeah.
like the one I sent you.
Like the Jason Anderson.
Oh, don't give it away. Oh, yes.
article.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Spoilers.
That's a spoiler for episode 2.
Edit me out.
No, that's fine.
Right.
All right. Okay. And I'm just going to give some background on like what we are talking about. So in what I will call the orthodox view of lesson planning, the first and most important step in planning a lesson is to decide your aims. It's important to say your aims so that you know and so learners know what they are supposed to be learning. And just to give an example of a lesson aim, it might be something like students will be better able to use past simple positive verbs when talking about a holiday they went on. And conventionally, it's thought that aims should fulfill certain criteria. So they should be specific. They should say exactly what language point you're focusing on. They should be achievable. So students will be better able to do something, not they will be able to do it correctly 100%. And they should be measurable. So there should be some standard by which you can judge whether the aim has been met. And this is normally a productive, free or practice activity, speaking or writing.
Yep.
And the premise of the paper that we're talking about is that this whole practice of setting and using aims and planning your lessons around aims is actually harmful. So just to quote from the first section, Allwright advocates planning for richness of opportunity and especially for understanding, not planning to determine highly specific learning outcomes. So in other words, he's saying when you're planning a lesson, you should not start by choosing your aims like everyone says to do, but instead you should start by thinking something like, how am I going to make sure that there are opportunities to learn in this lesson, that I exploit the opportunities, that there are opportunities to understand. In the paper, he refers to aims as teaching points, and I think it means the same thing. So it could be a point of grammar or vocabulary or a subskill or a function. And so in the first section, Allwright traces the history of the teaching point in ELT, starting with his experience of being a teacher in Sweden in the 1960s, where the importance of the teaching point was just a natural consequence of the methodology at the time. So before communicative language teaching, it was just based on on presentation and practice of discrete language points. And then he reflects that, so in the 1980s, we get the emergence of communicative language teaching, or CLT. And at this point, there is a massive shift in teaching methodology. And just skimming over quite a lot of detail about that, the average language lesson went from teacher-centered and based on explicit language instruction and students not talking to each other to a much more student-centered classroom with people interacting and much more effort to mirror real-life communication. So in this history that he's giving, he goes through different challenges that might have been made to the teaching point. And so his reflection about CLT is that despite the massive shift in methodology, there was no shift in use of the teaching point, essentially because people found ways of itemizing communicative content. And it could have gone a different way. So they could have used a more radical version of CLT so that would be the idea that the only thing that you need to learn a language is just to communicate in the language. And he describes his attempt to teach a class in that way. And so he says he didn't have any aims. He just looked for tasks that he thought would encourage language production and just be useful for the students. And he says that approach, radical CLT, never took off because it frightened teachers. And then it didn't, I think people just didn't know how to fit that in with courses, which were, I guess, all based on course books. Whereas if you could just take a structural syllabus of grammar and vocabulary points and then teach the lesson in a communicative way, then you don't really need to change anything from that point of view. And then another failed challenge is learner autonomy, just giving learners more responsibility over the course content, which has obvious benefits. So arguably learners are in a better position to say what they need and what their interests are than a teacher or someone who doesn't know them, like a coursebook writer. And learner autonomy is also not a challenge to the teaching point because it's just having learners do the same thing that the teacher would do. So they just impose teaching points on themselves. But the way in which a teaching point is limiting learning would be the same whether it's chosen by the learners or the teacher.
Agreed. Yeah. They wouldn't be able to see what they need any more than a coursebook writer in Cambridge can see what a Thai student needs in one of our classrooms.
Yeah. Well, they might be, but I think the point is it's like, so this thing of committing to an aim. So you say, okay, this is the thing I have to do in 2 hours, and I'm going to ignore any other incidental learning.
Yes.
That's the thing, which he will explain more in the paper. But then there is there are two more challenges to the teaching point. So the first one that he acknowledges as a valid challenge is task-based learning, or TBL. And so this is the idea that the prime unit of planning should be a task, where a task is defined as a communicative activity, so it involves interaction, something which is plausibly similar to a task that you would do in real life, so maybe a job interview or a research project, a survey. And priority is placed on the result or the outcome of the task. So there's some tangible decision that has to be made or something that has to be created, and maybe you have to meet certain criteria. And I think the key point about TBL is that the task will not tell you what language to use. So you can use any language you want as long as it fulfills the task. And the teacher might have ideas about what would be useful, and then they would have feedback about, like, oh, this word would have helped you. But yeah, so no specific language points the aim of a task-based lesson. And Arthur, I know that you are a fan of TBL. So yeah, I guess my question for you would be, do you think task-based learning could replace the teaching point altogether?
That's a big question. Not sure that I've thought carefully enough about how to map that onto a more macro educational context like a course book or a syllabus. And I think that when people try to do that with TBL, they struggle. Is it Cutting Edge that was originally devised as a TBL course book? And you can see actually it does have some lovely tasks in it, but really it's turned into something else. It's turned into task, practice, produce, I think, with a teaching point at the beginning of the book. So it's very difficult to make a curriculum out of task-based learning, as far as I know. What I will say is I see tremendous value in it as a lesson shape, and I see tremendous value in it as something that you would advocate to teachers at the beginning of their career. Try to get their buy-in as soon as you possibly can. Introduce it as early as you can on teacher training courses, because for me it is based on first principles of second language acquisition. I think that most of the writers that I've read agree that unless you're in a truly immersive environment, or you're a young learner who's within the critical period of language acquisition, you need exposure, lots of exposure to language, and you need a focus on form. You need those two things. And task-based learning provides them in quantity in every lesson. The exposure comes first and then the focus on form comes afterwards, and that's really important because in the PPP lesson it doesn't. Focus on form comes first.
Could you briefly define exposure and focus on form?
So exposure would be the language that you hear, the language that you read, the language that is around you. So when you're acquiring your first language, you are constantly exposed to language. It's everywhere, and you acquire a lot of it just by having it around you. For second language learners, that exposure is also very important. So normally, if somebody goes to an English-speaking country to learn English, then they will see quicker results than somebody taking 2 hours a week at a language school in Madrid or Bangkok. So exposure is very important. Focus on form is simply an analytical attention to language. So error correction is an example of focus on form. Color coding ED endings on a whiteboard would be a focus on form. Asking students if something is a noun, a verb, or an adjective is a focus on form. Yeah. So I think that TBL provides that. It provides exposure because there's a task where all the students are working together to produce and therefore also receive language from each other. Often there is material for them to read or listen to as well. Something's brought into the classroom to set up that task. So there's a lot of exposure. But crucially with task-based learning, the focus on form happens after the students have produced language. It doesn't happen before. And that's the big difference, I think, between TBL and PPP. And to my mind, it's a more principled way of teaching, because it's essentially reacting to students' linguistic or skills needs at the point of need in the moment. It's very emergent in that sense. Mm-hmm. I think so for those of you who have some understanding of TBL, you'll know that what makes it intimidating is that the teaching point, if you like, is not decided until the learners are doing the task. And while they are doing the task, the teacher decides what to teach. Normally, this is framed in terms of language. So if learners are negotiating on which items to take to an island where they have to survive for a month, and they can only choose 5 items to take with them, then there's a lot of language that's likely to come out of that task. They're going to speculate and hypothesize, so there'll be the need for conditionals, particularly first conditional. And there will also be the need for a lot of verb-noun collocations: cut our way through the forest, snare animals in traps, light a fire, keep warm. There'll be lots of lexical chunks and collocations that they might need. But I think that the thing about TBL is that it's not just that you don't know what language you're going to teach. You don't know whether you're going to teach a language class or a skills class. So in the lesson that I've devised, the task involves people looking for a new flat. So in the first set of slides, you can see the flat that I was living in at the time, in Chiang Mai. And in the second set of slides, I introduce some problems with this flat. So it's a little bit cramped. You can see that I've had to stuff some of my clothes in a space above the desk.
That's what that is. Okay.
And there's a door between the bedroom and the living room which didn't insulate things well. I was my girlfriend at the time was also a teacher trainer, and we were working online. So one of us was trying to sleep, and the other one was waking up at 4 a.m. to do an input session. So there were things about this flat that weren't perfect, and the bathroom was really weird because you could see into it from the bedroom. So we had to make sure those blinds were pulled down all the time. Whoever came up with that design feature, I don't know who they are, but I don't thank them. But the main problem that we were really worried about was this plot of land just outside. We actually had a really gorgeous view of Doi Suthep mountain behind this vacant lot, but we were just so paranoid that they were going to start doing construction work on this while our lease was going on. So we had a 6-month lease, and we decided we're not going to renew this. We need somewhere else. So in the next slides, I set up the task. I show the students what our requirements are in terms of location, and then I also give them specs on the next slide.
Not that. Okay, not.
Yeah. So I also say that we cannot be on a low floor because of all the creepy crawlies that inhabit Chiang Mai. Scorpions, giant centipedes, Tokai geckos, and spitting cobras. So we don't want to be too close to them. We want to be on a high floor in a condo. Thank you very much. And then I give some more specs that we need. So here they are. The next job of the students is to go onto this website and find 3 options for me to view. They also have to look at a map of Chiang Mai on Google Maps, but that's embedded in the website as well, so they can see in the website where these options are and check whether they are within my zone that I want to live in. So there's lots of language that comes out of this task when students do it. They use a lot of comparatives, for example. That's the language point that most teachers would immediately say, oh, this is a comparatives lesson. So this one's closer to the city centre. This one has a bigger swimming pool. This one's more modern. So, yeah, I mean, it could you could have a teaching point. But what's interesting is what happens when you actually use this material with students. So the first time I used this lesson, yes, students were making some mistakes with comparatives, but that wasn't the biggest problem at all. The biggest problem was they couldn't read a map. And also that they were being disturbed by the bot on the website that was asking them, "Can I help you?" They got disoriented by that. So there were basic digital literacy skills that came out of student performance that meant that I threw my lesson plan out the window, if you like, no more comparatives, and just taught them how to better navigate this website. And then we did the task repeat. So they repeated the same task again. So it became a skills lesson rather than a language lesson. And I didn't know that was going to happen. And that's the beauty of TBL.
And was that you changed it to a skills lesson the second time round, or within the first?
Within the lesson. Within the lesson. I mean, it has to be said that does require being quite practiced to do that. But I think if the students demonstrate a clear need for something, even novice teachers can be aware of it, even if they don't know how to solve the problem. I think they can be aware that the problem's there. Yeah.
The way you describe TBL, so this idea that you don't know what the aim is until they've started doing the task. I mean, I like it. Like, it's a great idea if you can pull it off. But if I think about less
the aim
experienced
is that they
teacher,
complete the task.
well, no, but like because you mentioned comparatives and a sub skill and so there's this idea that there's going to be some focus on form. And I think the aim is to make them better able to complete the task. So,
Yes.
So I think you are expected to help them with the language in some way. If they find the task really difficult, you need to do something.
Yes.
And you're saying it could be a grammar point comparatives, or it could be a sub skill.
Yes.
And
we don't know what their most pressing need is going to be when we set up the task.
And if I think about a teacher fresh off a CELTA, they may have never taught comparatives before. They don't know what reading sub skills are. I think that could be overwhelming for a less experienced teacher.
I mean, the main problem there, if I can speak frankly, is that on the majority of CELTAs, TBL is not focused early enough, and it's not focused often enough. There are many different ways of training a CELTA course, but the method that most trainers employ is to base the 8 or 9 lessons around the course book, one at a lower level, one at a higher level. And only at TP7 or TP8 will the trainees be expected to sort of deviate from the course book, find their own materials, start questioning the course book, and moving beyond it. There is another way of doing a CELTA, which is to flip that process round and to start materials free. So to start by telling teachers, go into the class, tell the students a story about yourself, make it interesting, use some pictures to enliven that context, and then get the students to tell a similar story about themselves and listen to them. And that's actually a very nice 45-minute lesson the first time you meet new students. I'm sure you've done similar lessons yourself. And the advantage of doing that, of moving away from the course book, is that you really get to know the student's language. And I think that adopting TBL or even Dogme early in a CELTA just lets you get to know the student's language a lot more than using a course book and using a more traditional PPP or text-based presentation.
Yeah, I think there are very good arguments for TBL, and I think it's not difficult to persuade people of that. But I think it is difficult to always have enough language awareness that you are able to notice what students need help with. So in my experience, people in their first year of teaching tend to have they tend to find it quite hard to listen either for errors or for gaps.
Yeah.
But even if you can listen for errors, I can hear people not using the third person S or not using past forms. So when I first started teaching, I mainly just heard grammatical errors, and I couldn't hear gaps, and I couldn't hear maybe a lack of functional language.
Yeah, it's much harder, isn't it, to hear what isn't there. So there's especially when you're teaching higher levels. I mean, we talked a while ago about the idea of avoidance, that intermediate and upper intermediate students in particular are very comfortable in the language that they already have, and they can use it to do almost anything. They can live in English for a day without too much noticeable effort. There'll be repetition, there'll be self-correction, there'll be some fumbling around in the dark looking for the right word, but by and large they can function in English for as long as they need to, but it's with a limited range of English, and they avoid structures which are harder or less familiar to them. So the classic case is modals. Intermediate students will often overuse maybe and overuse can at the expense of might, could, may. And I think that I wasn't really aware of that until I took my Delta. I hadn't really thought of avoidance as a type of error before I took my Delta. I thought errors were just yesterday I go rather than yesterday I went, something much more linear. So I agree with you that it's difficult. What I would say is that the beauty of task-based learning, having a task repeat, is that even if the teacher doesn't give much valuable feedback, the learners are going to improve anyway, because repetition on its own will cause, well, not cause, but is likely to lead to some learning. So learners themselves will become more fluent the second time they attempt an utterance. They will reformulate their own language. They will restructure their grammar, try it a different way. And so that process in itself amounts, I think, to learning. So even without explicit focus on form, or a teacher who's very focused on, this is exactly what my students need, the learners will still learn just by doing the task again. Mm-hmm. We can trust them to do that, I think.
Okay. So you said the two necessary conditions for second language acquisition are exposure and focus on form.
Yeah. The focus on form doesn't have to come from the teacher.
Okay.
Focus on form can come from the student.
Okay.
So if I think back to when I was learning Chinese, one of the most difficult structures, one of the most difficult areas where English and Mandarin interplay is positive sentences and negative sentences. So sentences which are expressed with a positive in English are often expressed with a negative in Mandarin, and vice versa. So we would say, I can't get there until 3 o'clock. So that's a negative structure with until, which is like a conditional, I suppose. But in Chinese, they would say, 3 o'clock, can get there. And I was walking around Shanghai for well over a year, formulating very awkward negative sentences, knowing that something was wrong. And then one day I distinctly remember walking down the street, hearing someone on a phone coming in the other direction, and just saying the phrase that I needed. And light bulb moment, that's how you do it. And I've never forgotten it since. So exposure can come from materials. It can come from other learners who are already producing something. It can, I think in a way, it can also come from yourself. If you are in the process of learning something and maybe you've heard it before and you say it, you think, oh yeah, that's right. So I don't think focus on form has to come from the teacher. So that's for me why the task repeat, even if the teacher is not doing very much teaching, the task repeat can still lead to acquisition or learning.
And do you think it has to be conscious, or could it be that could it be subconscious?
I don't know. I don't know. I can only really talk about my own language learning experiences, and I feel like they have been conscious. I feel like there has been attention. Like I'm ready to attend to language. So when I hear it, I notice it, and then I'm more likely to acquire it.
But I think people often just make intuitive judgments about language. So they'll say, well, that sounds better, and I don't know why. And I think that's valid as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's interesting. So the last challenge, just going back to the paper, the last challenge that Allwright gives to the teaching point from just the history and the literature is academic classroom research. And so he talks about data from classrooms with examples either of students not getting a teaching point, or examples of lessons where the mere fact of having a teaching point appeared to be hindering learning. So there's one lesson recording that he talks about where the teacher had an aim of clarifying the use of which and what. And the students have just done a gap fill exercise, and they're going round and checking the answers. And as they check the answers, students ask questions about words in the example sentences. So there's a student asks about the word context, and there's a discussion about that. And then someone else asks about xenophobia, and there's a brief discussion. And with each digression, there's a conscientious student who asks, where are we? So where are we in the grammar exercise? And so they're kind of getting the lesson back on track.
Yes.
And so his reflection is that all of the digressions, there might have been more learning opportunities in all of those digressions than in the teaching point. And so I think that in this example, I think it's not a good example, because clearly those example sentences were not graded properly. There should not be a lot of unfamiliar lexis in the example sentences in a grammar lesson, because that's distracting. What did you think about that example, Arthur?
I thought it was interesting because obviously I think I disagree with you about the need to not have too much distracting language. I don't know. Maybe I don't disagree with you. Maybe I haven't decided yet. I haven't decided whether I disagree with you about this. But what I will say is that you never get that with an authentic text. With an authentic text, there's always something interesting other than the language that you're focusing on, for I think two reasons. First of all, the grammar point is not repeated with such a frequency. So graded texts, as we both know, they seed target language very frequently. Often, a combination of two forms, like the present perfect and the past simple, so that students can go through and underline one in green and underline the other in blue and do some nice guided discovery. But in an authentic text,
I have authentic material with both of those. But anyway, yes, okay.
Yeah, you absolutely will. Like any newspaper article will have, it will start with the present perfect and then go into the past simple, because that's what the genre does. And you will have both. But you'll also have other stuff, won't you? You'll have direct and indirect speech. You'll have maybe distracting lexis. So I think that if you're a teacher that uses authentic texts, you get used to that. The idea that you have created a classroom environment that is lexically and grammatically rich rather than sort of neat. Rich rather than neat, I would say. So students are likely to get waylaid, to get distracted by vocab or other forms, and I'm not sure that's a problem. I'm really not sure.
So you think even if you're trying to clarify a point of grammar, it's okay if there are words that the students don't know in the example sentences? Doesn't it make it quite hard to infer meaning?
Said I didn't know if I disagreed.
Oh yeah, sorry, right. Okay.
So yeah,
Okay.
I think you make a good point there. I do. I really do. I think that when a teacher is checking understanding using a marker sentence, to have distracting vocabulary creates an extra burden on the student. I've seen this happen hundreds of times on CELTAs. I constantly say to my trainees, don't create concept checking questions that are harder to understand than the thing that you're checking. So that's definitely an issue. I do think that students can get used to an elaborative linguistic environment if they read more authentic texts, and possibly that burden becomes less just becomes less of a burden, right? They just become more used to it, more happy with it. Maybe the teacher answers the questions, the students are happy asking the questions. So, yeah.
Okay, no, that's a very fair point as well.
I'm not sure. I'm on the fence with that one. It's a really interesting. It's a really interesting point from his from his article. I really liked reading that section. Yeah.
And I think the point we can quibble with the details of the lesson, but I think the point he was making was that there were opportunities to learn that were not exploited, and there are some very nice passages in this part. So I'm just going to read, and this is Allwright's conclusion from having described these anecdotes. What learners get from a lesson is not predictable merely from what is taught in that lesson, and certainly not just from the teaching points covered. We all know that we must expect learners to learn less than has been explicitly taught, but we typically pay less attention to the more interesting phenomenon that learners can also learn more than has been explicitly taught. We cannot now sensibly measure the overall success of a lesson simply in terms of the percentage of teaching points successfully learned, because the learners may have learned little from the teaching points and a lot from everything else that happened in the lesson. Which is a really good argument. So
It's quite convincing, isn't it?
yeah, and so right, so like you cannot predict what they're going to learn, and therefore it doesn't this commitment to such a specific aim makes no sense when you look at how people actually respond in lessons in real time.
Yeah.
And I know that Scott Thornbury is also a fan of this paper, and he had an anecdote about observing a lesson where the teacher was focusing on using the present simple for daily routines. So just a normal PPP style lesson. So examples like, I get the train to work at 9 o'clock. I work from Monday to Friday. I don't work on Saturday. And at the end of the lesson, they got feedback from students. And one of the questions in the feedback form was, what did you think that the aim of this lesson was? Most of them said the present simple, like to clarify the present simple or to talk about daily routines. But then one lady said that she thought the aim of the lesson had been to teach the use of prepositions. Neither Thornbury nor the teacher had thought of that as something that might be learned. And it just so happened that all of the example sentences
Yeah.
contained prepositions. So at 7 o'clock.
Different prepositions, didn't they? Yeah.
Yeah, and on Saturday and from Monday to Friday. Yeah. And so maybe the student was not interested in the present simple, maybe she knew it before, or maybe she wasn't ready to learn it. And the point is that if you are only measuring the success of a lesson in terms of this one aim, this one language point, then you miss the learning of people like her.
Learning is messy, and you don't know what the students are going to take from your lesson, and the language that you're teaching is never so isolated that they can't learn something else, which they might be more motivated to learn on any given day. Yeah.
And that's also a really good argument for using texts, and especially using authentic texts, because there are a lot more things that learners can notice about them.
Yeah, and I think that, the last time we talked about the teaching point, in one of the moments where I was attacking the teaching point in the course book, I said that if you look at the front page, or the front 2 pages of a course book, where they've got those rows of the units and what you learn in them, the teaching point tends to be a bit obsessed with the verb. It tends to go through the English verb forms one by one, stopping en route to do some stuff with countable and uncountable nouns, quantifiers, bit on comparatives, maybe adjective order, adverbs of frequency, but there's quite a lot that has never made it into a coursebook teaching point. Coursebooks don't do nearly as much on genre. One reason is that they tend to use graded texts. Graded texts don't have genre. They've lost their genre to be graded texts, because the genre is all the good stuff that you've got rid of. And they tend not to do much on discourse. They tend not to look at how language operates in a paragraph rather than just a sentence. Maybe in articles lessons they talk about, we start by using a, and then we move to the when we know which specific one. So that's an example of discourse. But maybe there'd be a lesson on this, that, these, those as referencing words. But there's not an awful lot. There's not much on spoken and written discourse, on genre awareness. And if you use authentic texts, then it's amazing when you start using authentic texts, because suddenly you've got all these, Allwright would call them learning opportunities, I think, wouldn't he? He would say, when you use an authentic text, suddenly you have all these learning opportunities, because authentic texts are bigger, more varied, messier, and the language point has to be kind of noticed and picked out more, because it's not highlighted for you.
I think the challenge is just not overwhelming. Even intermediate level learners could be overwhelmed by an authentic text.
Yeah, I agree.
And yeah, so I am a low elementary level reader of Thai, and I would much rather I would rather have a totally inauthentic text that has all the words I know and it's just recycling the words I know, rather than an authentic text that is mostly gobbledygook.
How do you respond to environmental sign in Thai? For example, when you're on the SkyTrain, the public transport system we have here in Bangkok, when you hear an announcement that's made at every station, like Setani Topai, Prakanong, or Setani Topai, or Nut, you hear the same thing. Are you comfortable with that? Do you guess what it means? Do you play that game of trying to work out the environmental sign when it's very small texts like that?
Do I play the game of trying to guess the meaning?
Yeah. Or when you see a shop sign and you know 5 of the 7 characters,
Yeah.
you kind of got an inkling of what the word might be.
Yeah, I mean, yes,
Yeah.
there's a lot of guessing, yes. But if I have to actually sit down and read something or actually listen to something and I actually need to understand it, then I would rather have an inauthentic text.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I always think that with elementary groups, you just have to use really short text. If you're using authentic texts, then things like TikToks and Reels are perfect because often they've got very visual situation with a couple of subtitles. Someone says 3 or 4 sentences and then it's over. But it is authentic. It's from real life. Often those things are designed to be pithy and witty, or to convey something quite meaningful about life. So I think there's still an opportunity to use very short texts with elementary, and it helps them. But should they also be using graded texts? Maybe. I don't have a problem with low level learners using graded texts to give them exposure to some grammar. Yeah.
We've digressed, which I guess is fitting.
Interesting topic.
But anyway, yeah. So the last argument that Allwright has made about how use of a teaching point could limit incidental learning, I think it really makes sense just because of like what learning is. So because I think that learning is inherently unpredictable.
Yes.
So learning is, and to use a metaphor, learning is not pouring knowledge into the bucket of a student's mind. Learning is more like shining a searchlight in the dark. So it's a selective process, and it's active, and it's irreducibly in control of the learner, and it could be indirectly influenced by the teacher.
Yeah.
But you cannot predict what someone will learn.
Well, as Larson Freeman says, teaching does not cause learning.
Right. I think
Yeah.
he quotes her in this text.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then so that's the history, and then the challenges, the problems with the teaching point, and then in the next part of the paper, he sort of indicates what the new view of teaching and the new view of lesson planning would look like. And so he gives criteria. He calls it a unit of analysis, but I think that's basically just like a way of thinking about lesson plans. And so it needs to meet 3 criteria. One is that the scope needs to be flexible. So it could be a very small language point, or it could be a very broad topic. It needs to avoid cause and effect interpretation. So it needs not to say the thing that Larson Freeman said, Freeman.
Yeah.
So in other words, you just need to avoid the assumption that what you teach is going to be learned. Just avoid the assumption of that causal connection. And then the third criterion is agency, which means that there should be no distinction between the students and the teacher, because they co-construct learning in the lesson. And so
I don't think he's ever taught in a South London comprehensive, has he?
well, yeah, I mean, yes, it's interesting. So he thinks, and he's part of this thing called exploratory practice. And in exploratory practice, you refer to the teacher and the learners jointly as practitioners.
Yes.
But yes, I mean, obviously,
it requires very well-behaved students to have such an Elysian learning environment, I think, where everyone's engaged in co-constructing learning. Yeah. Even here, even with our very conscientious and motivated students at IH Bangkok, I think there needs to be a degree of class management and control from the teacher, right? It's quite important.
I don't know if he more had in mind the state school context or the adult learning.
He worked in both, didn't he? He was mainstream abroad and also in language centres, I think so.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe part of what he's trying to do is to question the authority of a teacher in the state comprehensive. And maybe he thinks if you, like, there's a way of dealing with that situation that doesn't involve the teacher just being a dictator. Yeah. I mean, I think the average student, if you take the average student in any context, then they would not accept this statement about teachers and learners being the same thing.
True.
And so even in our context,
learners would want a teaching point, I think, and that's a really important thing to remember. Most learners feel comforted that a teacher with an aim.
Yes, yeah, and I think they want the teacher to have thought about the language point and thought about how to explain it, and often a lot of effort goes into that. That's why I mentioned the problem of less experienced teachers using TBL. If the students do a task and you're going to teach them about whatever they struggle with, and maybe they struggle with a sub-skill, maybe with a grammar point, maybe with a function, you don't have that in your repertoire when you're fresh off a CELTA. So I think in many cases it's better for those teachers to just read up on the thing that they're teaching that day and think about that and how to explain that, rather than do a task and kind of try and deal with the language on the fly. I think both are very valuable, though. I just think there are obvious pros and cons to both.
I think one of the really interesting things about having this conversation is where we both come from, because you're the DOS of a school, so you're looking after 10 or 11 teachers at the moment, some of whom are quite new. Very hardworking, but they're quite new, fresh off their CELTAs. And definitely, yes, they're learning how to analyze language. They're learning how to clarify language. And this is all happening in quite a high stakes world where you've got real clients who can complain if things go wrong. Whereas CELTA is, I mean, the privilege I have is that it is a kind of artificial construct. I mean, the students that we bring in for teacher training, are getting it for free, so they never complain, and by and large they're very used to the type of lessons that we teach if they've been coming for a few months. So they're very, very good students for novice teachers to be unleashed on. So I do wonder how my views would change if I were doing your job. I do wonder how I would advocate TBL with a brand new teacher fresh off a CELTA. I think it would have to be done very incrementally.
But when you train on the CELTA, do the trainees ever do task-based lessons?
It depends on the CELTA. So here, no, because as a CELTA tutor, either it's your course or you're training someone else's course. And here I'm training someone else's course. This course was not designed by me, so I just fit in and do what the course tells me to do. But when I run my own courses, I bring in TBL very early. They do a task. They do a task in their first TP, and they use an authentic text in their second TP. So it's deep ending them, and then we always say that they can use course books if they want. We have a bank of course books that they can use, and we say, you know, if you're really struggling with this, if you're staying up till midnight trying to come up with ideas for your lessons and you can't think of anything, just use a course book. You know, here's the level, here are the topics, this is the best unit, this is the unit that's closest to what we're looking at. So some of them choose to do that, and then maybe next lesson they get braver, so they plan from scratch. And then we introduce everybody to course books at TP5 and TP6. So the 5th and 6th lesson, they have to use course books, because it would be silly to do a CELTA that had no practice of course books, because the vast majority of language schools will expect new teachers to use them. So they need to have some experience of using a course book. But I don't think they need to use a course book 8 times. I think twice is quite enough. One language, one skills.
And so that's on your course. It's the task-based lesson is always at the beginning.
Yeah. And then there'd be more at the end because they can choose what to do in the second half of the course, really.
So the reason I'm asking is that I wonder, of all of the disaster lessons that you have observed, are they usually the task-based ones or the PPP lessons?
PPP ones.
Really?
PPP ones.
Okay.
And the main reason for that is that course books are so intimidating for new teachers. Course books are incredibly intimidating for new teachers. Think about a 45-minute block of time. You have a page in a course book that has maybe 7 activities on it. So this teacher is learning how to give instructions. They're learning how to grade their language. They're learning how to monitor. Maybe they've never written on a whiteboard before, so they're learning all these skills. And they have to do them 7 times in 45 minutes. So the great thing with TBL is you pare it right down. The staging for a TBL lesson can be task, teach, task. And you cut out all of those minutes spent trying to remember the precise staging for giving instructions. Do I give the handout first? Do I do this first? Because you don't have to do it so many times. The lesson shape is much simpler. Course books are tremendously overcrowded, I think.
So just more material and more...
Yeah, and a lot of it, a lot of it, I don't know if you agree, but I think some of it is filling column inches, in a course book. I don't think even the course book writer would say that everything in their course book is incredibly valuable. I think they would say, well, we had a bit of room in this unit, so we decided to put a gap fill in here, in this space on the page. Yeah? Is that fair?
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Because, it is being made to a formula.
Yeah. Like it has to
They
have the
really
same
tight
structure.
deadlines. Yes.
And like the A unit and the B unit and everything is the same length.
Yeah.
And
so for novice teachers, I think it's incredibly intimidating using a course book. I don't think it's nearly as intimidating to say, go and set up a task, see what the students say, and respond to it in some way. If you don't feel ready to deal with their language, just make the students feel heard. Ask a follow-up question. So say, oh, that's interesting. Tell me why you think that. Or that's interesting. Where did that happen? Were your family with you when you did that? Because those questions can lead to learning, because they develop conversational fluency and they push the students further. That's my experience.
okay, that's interesting.
And exactly the same would be said of a process writing lesson versus a product writing lesson. The product writing lessons always go wrong because they are packed with analysis of model texts. Look at all these linking words. Look at the order of content. Oh, and look at this grammar and look at the adjectives. And now finally get the students to write. But it's 37 minutes into a 45 minutes. It's too much pressure. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so going back to the to the point from the article, the point being that we should not distinguish between learners and teacher. Yeah, there are obvious difficulties with it, but then it's obviously true that there is some kind of joint co-construction of a lesson, and that's a good point. And so in the later sections of the paper, Allwright begins to describe the different processes which are involved in learning. So there's a mix of overt and covert processes. So I think that's explicit and then non-explicit and conscious and conscious and unconscious. And the relationship between all those processes is not predictable.
Yes.
And then, so this idea of learning opportunity, so that's like any chance to learn something in the lesson, like a gap that the teacher notices or an error. And he points out that learning opportunities have cognitive, affective, and social characteristics. And so the cognitive would be in terms of analyzing language.
Yes.
And then the affective, the important thing about the affective as in relating to emotions, and the social characteristics of a learning opportunity, those are determined by the learner and not by the teacher. So that's another respect in which the teacher is not really in control of what's happening. And then he goes into the implications for planning lessons. And
Right.
so, as he stated at the beginning, we should not be planning for precise learning outcomes, and we should be planning for, quote, richness of experience. And I wonder what he means by that. Does he mean something like you should plan for an interesting conversation, or plan for a lot of language production? It's quite a vague term.
I think he probably does. Just when you read an article, you kind of get a sense of who someone might be, and he does seem an advocate of more student talk and less teacher talk, and moments where learners are more in control through tasks, through conversation. So probably he would advocate for a lot of learner conversation and a variety of language being dealt with in the classroom, I think. Not closing down opportunities the way that we talked about earlier with the what and which example. That's my feeling.
Yeah.
It's all a bit woolly, isn't it? When you're running a language school, how do you say to your teachers, "I'd like you to go and create a richness and
Richness of experience.
Richness of experience." I mean, it's not very tangible. How do you make that idea tangible to a teacher?
Yeah. I mean, I take a middle ground position because I don't want to give up teaching points. I think they have value. Even for experienced teachers. So I talked earlier about less experienced teachers finding task-based learning difficult to do effectively. But I think that there is still a place for thinking about a specific language point and how to explain it well.
Yeah.
I think that does help students. And at the same time, I think that you can't just robotically go through the stages of your lesson plan. There has to be flexibility and responsiveness to the learners. And I think you need both.
Yeah. I mean, I think the process of having this conversation over the last couple of weeks has been really enriching for me, because I have clarified my own position on the teaching point. As a devotee of task-based learning and dogma, I don't like the idea very much. But now that we talk about it, I think that I'm less offended by in fact, I'm not offended by the teaching point. I'm not offended at all by the idea that a teacher, before their lesson, decides to teach something and works very hard to plan a class around that point. The offence I take is more where that point comes from. So if you're following a structural syllabus in a course book, then that teaching point has been decided upon by someone probably in a different country who's never met your students. And that's where, for me, the problem is. If one of your teachers were to teach a class on a Tuesday, they would notice things. They would notice things when the students produce language in a production stage. Maybe things that they were not able to deal with in that lesson because they didn't have time, or because it wasn't connected to the target language of the day. So I think that can very legitimately become their teaching point for tomorrow. I think getting teachers to think, what's my teaching point for tomorrow, is supportive enough. They maybe can't think, what's my teaching point right now while I'm listening to the learners complete this task. But, okay, my learners have just done this task. What's my teaching point for tomorrow? That's a bit more manageable, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, yes.
And it's still reactive to the learner's needs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that strikes a good balance between being responsive and having a plan and being organized.
Yeah.
The examples that Allwright describes of lessons honestly just sound a bit messy. So there's another anecdote of a group that he taught that he noticed during the lesson that they were struggling with word order. Or it may have been they reported problems with it. I think they did a self-study session before the class. I don't know if you remember this anecdote.
Yeah, I do. It's when he was working in the Polish school, I think. Yes.
And so he decided to spend the class with everyone looking through grammar books, looking for help with word order. And then eventually they found an exercise that was useful. And so my question would be, so first of all, isn't this just focusing on a teaching point, but it's just chosen by the students? And isn't it inefficient to spend lesson time just looking for something helpful? So shouldn't it be, like you said, it should be the teacher goes and looks for useful material and then brings it the next day? So it just sounded a bit messy.
Yeah,
for my liking.
I can see that. I mean, I wasn't there, but it doesn't sound like the most efficient way of dealing with that. I think that if learners have problems with word order and you realize that at minute 30 in your 60-minute class and you're not ready to do a board clarification, or you're not ready to get some example sentences up on the board to clarify, then it's probably best to leave it till the next day, right? Yeah. Or if they're producing some writing, focus on it in feedback to the writing. Yeah.
I think it could have been that was the only opportunity to deal with the problem. And he's got another anecdote about a teacher who was having behavioral problems in her class. Her class was kept speaking Portuguese.
Yes, I remember that one.
And so in keeping with exploratory practice, she got them to talk about why they kept reverting to Portuguese.
They had a really good conversation about why they weren't speaking English.
Yeah, and well, and it sounded like just by getting them to think about why they were doing it solved the problem. So just asking them why is this difficult was in itself very helpful. And so I think part of exploratory practice is this idea of planning for understanding. So any difficulty that you have with the language or with your behavior in the class should be an object of curiosity.
Right, yeah.
Which is interesting. And I guess my main question would just be how to put this into practice in real life. Yeah, and like how systematic it would be, and would you build a course around planning for understanding? Or is it just because I mean, it's because reflection activities are quite common.
Is it possible, I mean, one of the things that Allwright says is a major challenge is, like, if you don't have a teaching point, how do you plan? Yeah. So is it even possible to build a course around the idea of learning opportunities? Because I mean, one thing about PPP and course books is we do know how to do it. It may not always lead to the most satisfactory lessons, but we do know how to do it. I know how to teach a TBL lesson. I know how to be responsive to learners in a classroom, but I don't know how to write a course based on responsiveness and student-centeredness.
I know that there was some research done by Judith Hanks applying exploratory practice to her context, which was English for Specific Purposes, or ESP. I think she was working in a university, and she described how I think the students had to just choose questions that they wondered about.
Yeah.
And part of it is not fundamentally changing what you do in the classroom. So integrating exploratory practice with what you already do. So I think her students were already having to do research projects and conduct surveys.
Yeah.
And so just making it about questions that the students wondered about.
Right.
which is a great idea. And yeah, I think we could definitely be doing more of that in my school. Is it the same for your context?
I think so.
Would the CELTA course be helped?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the depressing things about this article is that it was written so long ago, and it documents what he's been saying for, he was saying these things maybe 40, 50 years ago, and the battle for student-centeredness still has not been won, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, the vast majority of coursebook material that teachers take into the classroom is not the most beneficial thing they could be using in that in that 90-minute chunk of time, and the teacher, given a bit more training, maybe given a bit more time to prepare, could probably come up with something much better themselves. So yeah, I mean, on a CELTA we train people. We give them a toolbox of techniques that they can use, and we give them frameworks that they can follow, so that they can teach from a course book, so that they can walk into any language school and teach a relatively competent grammar or vocab or reading or listening or speaking lesson. But I think, yeah, we should be teaching them much more than that. And a lot of trainers do. But if you look at one of our timetables, it's very much focused on these are the techniques that you'll learn. These are the frameworks that you can teach. Yeah. There's more we could be doing. Yeah.
We've got to the end of the paper, and I just want to read a passage from the last part. And I think, yes, he's Allwright is also moderate in his thinking, and I think the following passage reflects that. So he writes, "I would not expect or want anyone to abandon teaching altogether, but I would hope people might consider how helpful it might be to downgrade the teaching point as a central concern, and to think instead in terms of learning opportunities, planning for experiences, and planning by teachers and learners for teachers and learners to deepen their understandings of language learning in the language classroom. I know that I am already asking a lot, but it could also be fun."
I think I quite like the conciliatory nature of that closing paragraph, because I feel the same way when I talk about course books. I say I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I just don't see why the course book has to be the default of every single class that's taught on a CELTA. And I think that's quite... does he resonate with me, or do I resonate with him? His ideas resonate with my experience. Yeah. So I liked the way he closed it there. Don't abandon the teaching point altogether. Just don't see it as essential to every lesson. How do you feel about the article?
Very mixed.
Yeah.
Well, not very mixed. No, I mean, it's a great article. I guess, yeah, I have a lot of questions about how it would work, how one would do exploratory practice, how you would plan, and maybe this is the wrong way of thinking about it, but how you would plan a course around exploratory practice.
Maybe that in itself is a paradigm that you're not going to be able to keep that. How do I plan my course paradigm if you go with his ideas, because as soon as you start planning it, it's not emergent anymore.
Yes. But yes, and I think reading it again has made me want to go back to look over our course outlines again and see where they can be more open and less rigid.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's a really good thing to take away.
Right.
All right. I know you've got to go. So thank you for doing this. And thank you for...
It's been a pleasure talking to you. A really interesting conversation.
Likewise. And thank you for listening, and see you next time.
Bye for now.